Greetings. I'm Dr. Nick Mather, and welcome to the first in my series on religion in America. I'd like to begin with a little family history. The first Mathers to come to the New World were the Reverend Richard Mather and his wife Catherine and their 4 sons. They arrived at Boston Harbor aboard the ship the James on August 17, 1635. Richard Mather was a Puritan, and he brought his family to the New World to escape persecution in England. They were part of a mass exodus of Puritans who left England for the New World. The Puritans were Calvinists who believed that the Church of England had retained too many vestments of the Catholic Church. The Church of England, of course, was created by King Henry VIII after he left the Catholic Church in 1534 so he could divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Under the guidance of Henry's son, Edward VI, the Church of England became more Protestant as the Protestant Reformation swept through England. Richard was suspended from the ministry twice for nonconformity as he refused to wear the surplice, the white linen gown worn by priests, and he refused to wear this while he preached. So he gathered his family and headed to the New World. They almost didn't make it as the James got caught in the great colonial hurricane just after anchoring off of the coast of Maine. 2 of the anchors gave way during the storm, taking the cables with them, and a third anchor cable had to be cut as the raging waters threatened to ground the ship. The sails were torn to shreds by the hurricane winds, and the James drove out of control toward a giant rock in the water. However, the Reverend Mather and his fellow Puritans prayed to God for his mercy. The ship cleared the rock, and the wind and sea calmed long enough for new sails to be hoisted, allowing the James to maneuver to safety. They saw this as a sign of divine providence. Richard Mather already had a reputation in the New World as a dynamic preacher, and several settlements wanted him as their preacher. He settled in Dorchester, Massachusetts, where he stayed until his death in 1669. After arriving in the New World, Richard would father 2 more sons, Eleazar and Increase. All of Richard's sons would pursue a career in the ministry except for one, Timothy Mather, who was known as the Farmer Mather, and it is through him that my family traces its lineage. The Pilgrims who arrived in the New World aboard the Mayflower in 1620, this was 15 years before Richard and his family arrived, were also Puritans. I also had an ancestor aboard the Mayflower, my 10th great-grandfather, Richard Warren. Not only did the Puritans want to escape religious persecution in England, but they wanted to create a new Jerusalem, a theocratic society, what Puritan John Winthrop called a shining city on the hill. Many features of Puritanism would contribute to the formation of American culture. The Puritans believed in education because they believed in the necessity of reading the Bible for oneself. Reading for oneself and thinking for oneself, it could be argued, laid the groundwork for the later revolution for independence and democratic governance. If only people still held on to these values of education and thinking for oneself. Harvard College, for example, was begun by the Puritans. In fact, Richard Mather's son, Increase Mather, was Harvard's first doctorate, becoming a doctor of sacred theology and the first person to be conferred an honorary degree in the New World. Increase Mather served as president of Harvard for 20 years. Richard Increase and his son, Cotton Mather, also a Puritan minister, were considered one of the most influential Puritan families in the colonies. Sociologist Max Weber, in his classic work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, argued that it was ideas in the Puritans' Calvinism that led to the widespread success of capitalism. In particular, was the Calvinist idea that humans were all born totally depraved. And this isn't just a spring break kind of depravity, but that we're all born wretched and in sin. Not a one of us is worthy of salvation. In fact, there's nothing we can do to achieve our salvation. The reasoning here is that God is perfect, and if God were to change his mind, that change would imply imperfection. So only a small handful of people, the elect, are saved, and they're saved by the grace of God. Obviously, a question arises as to who might be one of the elect. Are there signs that distinguish that someone is in fact saved? One answer was that if you were saved, you would naturally do good works because you would be called to do so, what is known as a vocation. So, wealth through hard work came to be seen as a sign that one was saved, and poverty, was often seen as a moral failing. You simply are not one of the saved. If you listen closely to politicians and political conversations, even if someone doesn't profess a religion, you can still hear them saying much the same thing, that someone's lack of wealth is due to a flawed character. So, in an attempt to prove their piety, the Puritans got to work. Never forget that while they may have come to the New World for religious freedom, the colonies were also corporate entities, and the natural resources of the Americas and the profit they could bring were every bit as attractive as religious freedom. Increase and Cotton Mather were both indirectly involved with the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692 and 1693. Cotton Mather published the book Remarkable Providences in 1684, which described the possession of the Goodwin children of Boston, which occurred after the 13-year-old daughter Martha Goodwin had an argument with the family laundress Goody Glover. Cotton took Martha into his home to study her behavior. He also met twice with Glover, attempting to persuade her to repent of her witchcraft. He was unsuccessful in this, and Glover eventually was hanged. It has been suggested that the publication of Remarkable Providences laid the groundwork for the Salem witchcraft trials. Cotton Mather was friends with many of the judges, and Increase Mather attended at least one of the trials. Both Increase and Cotton approved of the use of spectral evidence in the trials. Spectral evidence was the claim that a person's specter, their ghostly form as it were, was tormenting the afflicted person. The victims claimed that the specters scratched and bit them or came to them in their dreams. Cotton Mather said this evidence should be considered, but should not be the sole factor in determining whether someone was guilty of witchcraft or not. Increase Mather would eventually reject the admission of spectral evidence, but only after the Salem trials were over and 19 people were hanged and one man was crushed to death. Cotton Mather wrote the first history of the trials, which was considered something of a whitewashing of the trials, which seriously damaged his reputation. He would eventually be scorned for his witch-hunting endeavors, and according to his diaries, he feared divine retribution for himself and his family for not having done more to stop the judges. As historian Perry Miller notes, Cotton Mather's last years were full of regret and remorse. Arguably, it was the witchcraft trials that were the beginning of the end of Puritanism in the colonies. Now, I want to be clear here. There were no real witches in Salem. Historians are still trying to figure out exactly what happened in Salem. It is likely that there were several factors at play, including religious hysteria and intolerance, misogyny, land disputes, and petty grievances, but not witches. However, I should also note that although the Puritans were intolerant of other religions, there was an interest in occult ideas. Folk traditions were brought from the old world, such as herbal cures, the creation of protective charms and amulets, and other occult practices. Colonial libraries from upper class estates of people living in the 17th and 18th centuries reveal texts on astrology, Hermeticism, alchemy, and Rosicrucianism. In fact, Cotton Mather dabbled in astrology. Puritanism was also challenged as other religious ideologies began to emerge in colonial New England, including Baptists and Quakers. Now, just to demonstrate the extremity of Puritan ideas, they believed that the Quakers were religious heretics, and some of the accused witches of Salem were Quakers. Although Puritanism did not survive long into the 18th century, it did persevere in the American ideas of self reliance and the belief in their moral superiority. It is also an unfortunate fact that the Puritans accepted the institution of slavery. It is a blight on my family lineage that Cotton Mather, who was considered the most important intellectual of his day, argued that African slaves should be converted to Christianity because, one, it would subdue them and lessen the risk of rebellion and escape, and two, once Christianized, their souls would turn white. So, yeah, my family has a lot to account for. And I didn't even get into Increase Mather's thoughts on the Native Americans. The Mathers have been called the last of the Puritan families. Puritanism had mostly evolved into Congregationalism by the early part of the 18th century. Not long after its demise, there would be a radical change in American religiosity in the form of the First Great Awakening, which will be the topic of my next video.